Hi, folks. Welcome to week 3 of Decolonial Narratives, part 2. Last week was a bit of a doozy, right? We had quite a bit of reading and engagement with the texts, and we read our very first play. And we're going to read quite a few plays this term, so it'll satisfy more this idea of the theatrical tradition, since our culture and ideas actually comes from the theater department. Um, and this week we are continuing a little bit of the foundational material that we have been reading in The Color of Law, and just the way that housing practices and city planning has perpetuated certain kinds of um, kind of demographic segregations and um, versions of oppressions. But even more so, we're beginning to think now about how a lot of these housing policies, government policies, and law contributed, whether directly or indirectly, to class issues in between Black folks and then other Americans as well. And so for today's Tuesday lecture, we're focusing entirely on Rothstein's chapter 2 in The Color of Law. And it's specifically on projects, housing projects. So I obviously have a vested interest in this because, indeed, for part of my childhood, I lived in public housing. And it has a certain kind of image. I mean, for just a moment, imagine what comes to mind when you think of the projects. Um, you might think of inner city. I use that term because I can't stand it. So I put it in air quotes because it's certainly euphemistic anyway. But we think of inner city. We might think of high rise towers, and we certainly think of black and brown bodies. And to some degree, that perception has an element of accuracy. We may also associate it with high crime, with the drug trade, violence. Maybe these things are somewhat true as well, or at least there is a propensity for it. What's interesting, though, is that a lot of people make the associations of crime, violence, and drugs to the black and brown bodies themselves, and not necessarily to the conditions of poverty, and certainly the way that public housing was managed, and that it became largely a regulatory and governmental um, fumble, for lack of a better term. But we're not going to examine public housing as being just a big mistake, because it actually is way more complicated than that. And while certainly a lot of public housing wound up being canceled for various reasons, largely due to poor oversight and management, um, we want to ensure that we understand the denotative aspects of public housing project or housing projects, and then the effect that the ones managed in America had, which is a very different take. We can't necessarily um, have entire correlation causation relationships here. Okay? First of all, we have to understand that public housing in America used to be mostly white. And it was built not necessarily to house poor folks, but to mitigate a housing shortage that had come about as a result of the fact that we are an incredibly privatized capitalist country. Um, the story begins kind of after World War I, and you can read about this in Rothstein's chapter, but I just wanted to create some highlights. Again, the original intent was to mitigate the low stock for lower to middle class workers. And that had everything to do with the Depression and then leading into World War II. During the Depression, there wasn't a lot of money. And a lot of people, they still needed housing, but they also did not have the kind of capital to buy expensive housing. On top of that, what used to build housing, private firms, did not want to build for a lower um, market value. I mean, there's a less of a profit margin, right? They wanted they wanted to build what would guaranteed them better income. So this is one of course, the pitfalls to a private industry. Private industries want to make as much money as they can. There's not as much money to be made in low income. There was a lot of low income people at the time during the Depression. Therefore, not much housing was being built, but babies were still being born, people still needed housing, and this is why the federal government became involved to some degree, or local governments, I'm sorry. Let's make sure that we're including both. But this is where the United States um, kind of joined in the public housing fray because private industries weren't building enough housing because they wanted their bottom line to stay good. Okay? And it was this period from the Depression to World War II that not enough housing was being built. The issue in World War II had to do with the need for people to live in areas like the Bay Area where the war effort was well underway with manufacturing enterprises and shipbuilding and all the things that you would need to kind of fuel the war. So people were coming in droves to these areas where the manufacturing was being done, namely places like Boston, San Francisco, Los Angeles, yeah, but there was no housing being built. And the housing needed to be affordable. And so still, private industry wasn't as interested in making the work for that. Housing is an interesting animal. It costs money to build no matter what. And do you want to build something for less money? You see where we're getting at? And this is where the government comes in. The issue with these housing projects was that we were still in the wake of Jim Crow laws. And as you've read already, there was a stigma against black bodies and black folks living in areas for lowering the value of homes in white neighborhoods. This kind of presumed racial supremacy extends even into the housing project issue. And so the New Deal projects that were initiated in the 30s during FDR largely kind of turned a blind eye or were explicitly segregated in order to satisfy the status quo of sociality that was pre-existing. They rationalized it by saying that the housing projects would reflect the demographic composition of what they were replacing or where they were being built, depending on the situation. And that led to something kind of interesting happening. While they tried to adhere to that policy, if there was a somewhat integrated community, the project itself would lean towards whatever that majority was and then become exclusively that majority. Or if it wasn't that particular circumstance, the circumstance of this kind of highly concentrated composition was making it so that it would crowd a neighborhood, and that became something that was undesirable, so that folks who perhaps had a little bit more capital would opt for another option, rather than be in something that was so dense. Yeah. And so it was the design of the projects themselves that kind of helped expedite segregation where the laws or the very direct kind of goals of politicians didn't necessarily infiltrate. And so the combination of kind of political leanings on the local level to the concerns about property values to the highly concentrated designs of these housing projects all contributed to a further perpetuation of segregation and actually made a lot of places even more segregated than they were prior. Now, then we have another phenomenon happen. After World War II, which the 10 years before was when most of the public housing had been built in America, afterwards, there was all of this kind of enhancement in manufacturing which made goods cheaper, namely cars. There had been lots of public works initiatives done, like freeways and transit systems that allowed for people to live further out from their places of work than they used to. It was now possible for families to buy cars, maybe even two, because they had become cheaper in their manufacturing. It had become cheaper to buy goods. And as a result, Americans could think in a different way about where they wanted to live. They didn't necessarily have to live so close to work. Options came available, including land that would be cheaper a little bit further outside of the city. So another program had been started, and it was the suburbanization of America, where other kinds of housing were being built for folks that had just enough more means to move out of places where there would be public housing and move into private housing that was affordable, but not as affordable as the public housing. This is the chicken in every pot. This is the white picket fence dream, the American dream, right? Where you could buy a house with a garage and have a small backyard for your kids, your 2.3 children, right? This whole idea. Levittown, New York becomes one of the first kind of suburban housing tracts that are built, where it's possible for a freshly returned GI and his wife to buy a house, a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, and still now with the newly minted freeways and their cheaper car could now drive into work and drive out. And it became a dream to have more space, to have light, to have a backyard, that kind of thing. And so the public housing became less desirable for people that had the means to move out to the suburbs. And that was, of course, because of discriminatory labor practices, largely white, that moved out. This is known colloquially, and I'm sure that you are familiar with this term, as the Great White Flight. And it happens from the late 40s on to roughly what we call the late American urban renaissance, which is the early 2000s. So what happens in a lot of public housing is that the segregated white projects, right? Remember, these were segregated for so long, had vacancies, while there was a shortage for the black projects in particular. So it was harder for black folks to get an apartment in public housing, even though there were vacancies in the white housing. And that made it so that a lot of black folks were beginning to double up in housing. For example, in the Western Addition in San Francisco, which was already kind of largely black due to the relocation of the Japanese that mostly owned the properties in that district. Well, now that the black folks had moved in, they were doubling up on each other because they could not get housing in the segregated public housing projects, despite the fact that there was vacancies in the white housing projects due to the segregating practices. And it created what a lot of people referred to as slums, overcrowding, where there were too many people in a building. And that was largely just due to what you have already read about in these segregating housing policies. This is what inspires, during the Truman administration, to declare a Public Housing Act in 1949. And this was the beginning of what becomes the common perception of public housing in America. Giant high rises in the middle of cities, all kind of looking like giant brick or concrete blocks. What's interesting about this is it was largely designed, or it was largely inspired by the designs of Le Corbusier, who was a modernist architect and city planner who thought of these high rises to go in the middle of 1920s and 19 teens Paris as a way to create pure equitability and highly concentrated views and delightful parkland down below. If you, instead of having spread out low rise, you had concentrated high rise, you have more green spaces. And that was his whole intent, to have the high rise. Now, even though it was well intended, the French were like, hell no, we don't want this. And largely it's because Le Corbusier's aesthetic was built on function, as we see with a lot of early modernists. And it did not take into account aesthetics. The idea was that function is form. This idea that we should value the aesthetic of something that functions, and that should be what's beautiful. Well, people like adornment, people like grace, and people like beauty for the sake of it. And Parisians rejected it in the early 20th century, and it was certainly rejected as an idea afterwards. But it was adopted in America because it was hella cheap. And that is ultimately what it was about. It was cheap to build tall per unit, and the cheapest property was in the areas that white folks had abandoned, that they had left in the Great White Flight. And so we see the Pruitt-Igos, we see the Cabrini Greens, we see the McCullough homes, we see these various massive high-rise projects being built post to 1949. Yet, because there was still this kind of perpetuating, segregating principle to this public housing, it became more and more concentrated for Black and brown bodies who, through discriminatory labor practices, were the most underemployed and who had the least amount of money. On top of that, the public housing projects were limited in terms of their oversight by the regulatory bodies, namely the government. There wasn't enough person power and resources dedicated to keeping the buildings up, to keep them beautified, to keep the green, to keep the landscaping attractive, things of this nature. And this was made even more complicated by the consolidation of these various public housing administrations when it was all kind of funneled into HUD, which was a cabinet, a federal agency through the cabinet that now oversaw all of the projects across the country. So the regulation would trickle down even less effectively as a result than if it was more of a localized system. And so this is the beginnings of the various associations that we make with public housing projects now, that they are crime-ridden, forgotten pieces in the urban landscape, inner city, black and brown bodies, violence. All of these associations kind of coalesce through a series of government and private decisions that are made. And despite the fact that public housing, again, initially was built for the needs of workers, middle and lower middle class workers, it eventually evolves into what we have now. This is really important to understanding the perception of Black America, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and how it also kind of coalesces into the national attitude towards low-income America. And we will pick up these perceptions and attitudes in the very first chapter that you're going to be reading of The New Jim Crow, which is your primary text that you are going to be reading the first chapter for this Thursday, which we're also going to have the wonderful pleasure of getting the very first presentation posted that we can all view as a complement to the reading. So this week is a little lighter. We only have the chapter in Rothstein and then later the chapter in The New Jim Crow and one discussion question. But that's mainly so that we can kind of downshift and really get ready for the discussions that we are going to have in The New Jim Crow. So until then, get enraged by this very complicated public housing policy and how it leads to the national perception of Black and brown bodies and inner city culture. And we will see each other on Thursday for my lecture then, and your first group presentation on the first chapter of The New Jim Crow. Have a good one, y'all.